recording? We're good to go. All right. Good afternoon. Welcome. Glad to have you all here. My name is Matt Larson. I am one of the assistants to Bishop Hassanelli in the Southeastern Minnesota Senate, and I'm glad to be with you all. I wrote the description of this workshop in haste, and it kind of sounds like I have an axe to grind, which I suppose I do. I just want to recall that for you. There are often strong opinions people have about, quote, the direction of the ELCA, end quote, or, quote, what the ELCA believes. These opinions are often informed by social media and anecdotes instead of what the ELCA has discerned together in their social statements, which is where we actually say what it is that we believe. So we are going to kind of take a quick look at where those things come from, how they come to be, and why that's important and why it's intentional. And then we're going to do a deep dive into one particular social statement. And I thought we'd pick an easy one about which people don't have strong feelings. So we're going to look at the social statement from 1991 on abortion. Right? How dumb am I? But it's a really good example of how I think people assume some things about what the ELCA actually believes, because I have personally had a number of conversations with people that were frustrated because they read tweets or Facebook posts from a pastor or from a bishop or from the presiding bishop that sounded very partisan in how they reacted to the Supreme Court's ruling on Roe versus Wade. And so I thought it would be good to actually look at the social statement on abortion so that we can talk about what, in fact, the ELCA actually believes, and to convince you all to stay off of Twitter and Facebook forever for the rest of your lives. Amen. That's not going to happen. Again, I said this a couple of times as folks were coming in. There are a lot of words on these slides. You might not be able to read them all, but I really wanted to lift a whole lot of quotes so that we could look at the actual statement. So when we get to that part of our time together, there's going to be a lot of words. I have a copy of the social statement on abortion that you're welcome to have, but I'm also, as we do this, going to explain to you how you can access it online, okay, along with all the other social statements. Any questions before we start?
Is there any way we can turn on just the front lights so we can see the screen better?
Oh, that's a good question. Anybody see light switches?
Right there. Yeah.
No, that looks like a timer of some kind. And
They're doing it.
okay, we'll see how they do. Oh, other way. That's the back ones. Does that help? All right, good. You're not missing anything. I'm not much to look at anymore. You still see me? Okay, sorry about that. So some preliminary considerations. Let's talk for a little bit about why it matters where the ELCA social statements come from. Please understand that we have elected leaders. Let's think specifically about the presiding bishop. There were lots of people that were incensed at things that the presiding bishop tweeted or posted on Facebook. The presiding bishop is elected at the churchwide assembly. We have elected leaders. Those elected leaders have opinions. Those leaders are free in the gospel to share those opinions just the same as anyone else. So it's not that they can't or ought not to do things. Public leaders face pressure in two directions. There are some folks that get really upset when somebody like the presiding bishop doesn't immediately tweet or post about something because they think that it's the presiding bishop's job to be prophetic. It's right there in the ordination vows. And if they're not being prophetic, they're just failing colossally. And plus all the other cool presiding bishops are doing it. So so they get pressure that way. But then there are also folks who are incensed anytime that the presiding bishop or any other public leader comments on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, because oftentimes it's seen as being partisan. And again, there's that word partisan. Rostered ministers at every level in the church, and I would say also you all as council leaders, from the most mundane, the most common, all the way up to folks that we only have one of, like the presiding bishop. We all need to take the public nature of our role into consideration. And every once in a while we run into a congregation that's upset with their pastor because the pastor posted something about Black Lives Matter or about Roe v. Wade or about who was the guy in Kenosha, Kyle Rittenhouse, and they did it on what they thought was their personal Facebook page. And the pastor tries to defend themselves. They say, right there on my page, I see these are my opinions. They're not the opinions of, South Elbow Lutheran Church or whatever place they're serving at. These are my personal opinions. Facebook is public, no matter what. And that disclaimer doesn't mean a thing. So if you're going to post about that stuff, there are going to be some people who are going to wind up being upset with you because they think you're being partisan. It doesn't mean that you can't do it, right? Nobody is muzzled or silenced, but you need to be smart about how you do that. We have boundaries training that my colleague, Pastor Emily Carson, does. I would say it's the best in the country. And that's one of the things that we talk about. Most of our public leaders do a really good job at this, but even when they do, folks still get upset. I've been in the Synod office call for 3 years now, and we've had a number of folks that still, finally, 2009 was a long time ago, 14 years, right? And every once in a while, we still get congregations that think it's time for them to leave the ELCA, which, to be clear, if that's what you as a body are discerning to do, God bless you. Find the right theological home. We've got no interest and we'll never do anything to keep that from happening. We will insist that you follow the process so that it's legal and so that things don't get complicated, but that's on your behalf, not on our behalf, right? So, we just recently had a call from a congregation that has finally discerned it's time to leave the ELCA because they don't like something the presiding bishop tweeted. They're going to bail on a century and a half of relationship with predecessor bodies and then with the ELCA because they don't like something that somebody tweeted, which just really makes me sad. Because again, we have elected leaders who are called to a particular role for a defined time, right? In the case of the presiding bishop, it's a 6-year term. Then there's going to be another church-wide assembly, and there's going to be a vote. If you don't like something that the presiding bishop tweeted, to me, the reasonable response is to not vote for that presiding bishop the next time that you go to the church-wide assembly. But that's not what everybody thinks is the right response. The distinction here is important, I think. A lot of people don't understand that our public leaders don't speak ex cathedra, by which I mean what they say and what they write and what they post and what they tweet as an individual is not how this church sets theology, policy, or doctrine. That's not how we do things. We have a process for that. And because we're Lutheran, it's a slow, laborious, frustrating, drug out, exceptionally wordy process about which people argue incessantly all the time that it's going on. But we have a process for it. We're going to talk about that process in just a minute. But the idea of nobody speaking ex cathedra, we would never give any one person that kind of power. It would never happen. There are Christian traditions where they have a linear vertical hierarchy where the person on top, what they say goes. That's not us. That is not us. We are a flat, congregational, bottom-up organization. Theology, policy, and doctrine are discerned by the whole body together and determined by votes informed by the Holy Spirit. So nobody gets to speak ex cathedra in our tradition. So if you want to know the process of this, you can go to elca.org and just to be simple, in the search bar, put in faith and society. That'll get you right to where all these things are laid out. And again, when you get these slides, there's hyperlinks that will take you right to it. One of the documents that you find on that particular page is called Policies and Procedures. It's 31 pages long. I'm quoting here from page 15 and 16 to describe the process. So how do these things get set? Synods, which are made up of congregations, bring issues to the church-wide assembly. So bottom up, a congregation in a particular synod has an issue that they think the ELCA should address. They memorialize the church-wide assembly to do that. And if the church-wide assembly decides to take that on, if it moves forward in the church-wide assembly, then there's a long process that takes multiple years to unfold. The ELCA calls together a task force. That task force, we have one going on right now in regards to civic engagement. I just happened to talk to somebody who's a part of that task force. And they're going to be doing their work for several years. You might remember back in 2009, for years before the church-wide assembly where those decisions were made, we were talking about what the social statement was going to be. So the task force comes together and they write a draft. They send that draft out to synods and congregations. Synods and congregations are supposed to engage with that material and submit their comments, but not everybody does. In 2009, there were all kinds of people that wound up being all torqued off and never once read, participated in a conversation about, or submitted a response to the proposed social statement at the time. And I understand that sometimes these are uncomfortable things to talk about, but if you don't vote, you don't get to complain. It is kind of where I come from. Yes, ma'am.
You just say what that, not everybody here was here in 2000.
Sure. So the one that was unfolding in 2009 was human sexuality, gift, and trust. So, yeah, I mean, these are big subjects. They are sometimes uncomfortable subjects. But I remember helping lead the two congregations that I was serving at the time through a conversation about that, at which a 90-year-old guy who couldn't hear a thing all through the whole conversation, as he was putting on his coat and hat at the end, he said, "Wait, I want to do that." So, anyways, that's just an aside. That was Henry. He was a sweetheart.
Matt,
Yes.
just a reminder to repeat the question so that the people on Zoom could hear it. Thank you.
The question was, I've referred to the 2009 decision and the social statement that was being discerned prior to 2009 was human sexuality, gift, and trust. I forgot about that, Marla. Thank you.
Thank you.
So synods and congregations study, engage with, and write up their responses and suggestions and convictions about that stuff. They send it back to the task force. The ELCA Church Council and the Conference of Bishops take all that stuff in, they synthesize all of it, and then they write out the final draft. That final draft goes to the next churchwide assembly, where again, it is voted on. So it's never just one person or one small group with an agenda that sets policy. It's the whole body together. And please note that the threshold for these things to pass is 2/3. It's a super majority when the vote finally comes. So broad participation, broad comment, so that we all together as the whole body of Christ that calls itself the ELCA have a say in this. Yes, ma'am.
It's pastors don't have the majority of assembly. Laity. So the notion that it's just pastors pushing.
Yeah. Yep.
Just want people to be aware of.
Yeah, the comment for the sake of our folks on Zoom was that pastors do not have the majority at churchwide assembly. So it's not just, one class of people or one group of people that railroad these things through. It's broad participation for both rostered and lay people. Once they get passed, they can be reconsidered. If you want to do that, again, the way that you get that to happen is by having a vote. So if the whole body discerns that it's time to revisit something, then we re-engage the process. What I'm trying to get to here is that this is all premised on a bottom-up direction, widespread opportunity to comment, and then the Holy Spirit directing a democratic decision-making process. So no one person, no small group of people ever has the power to ramrod things through. It's the whole body all together. And then there's a long legalese constitution that explains the rest of the policies and procedures. So thus far, using the policy outlined before, the church has adopted a whole bunch of social statements. And I just listed them here. This is the first half: abortion, caring for creation, church and society, church of criminal justice, the death penalty, economic life, education, genetics, health and healthcare, human sexuality, peace, race, ethnicity and culture, and sexism. So those are the social statements, which are the primary teaching documents of the ELCA. Those are the ones that we've adopted so far. We also have other things called social teachings and other things that are do not have the same kind of authority that social statements do. You can find those on the same page on the ELCA website. So go to ELCA, search for social statements, and this will get you to where you can find what we actually believe, teach, and say about these listed issues. You don't find that on Facebook or on Twitter or on any other social media. So let's have a look at one. Before we get into the one, this is rhetorical. I don't want there to be conversation and argument. I was just at a workshop called having hard conversations. I don't really have any hard conversations. So this is a rhetorical question. I just want you to pause for a moment and think to yourself, what is it that the ELCA believes, says, and teaches about abortion? All right, just to yourself. All right, you got yourself kind of oriented. So let's see what the ELCA actually believes, teaches, and says about abortion. If you go to the abortion social statement, you'll find lots of resources. There's the social statement itself. There's a study guide, there's an introduction, there's a brief summary, and then there's a social way to order hard copies if you don't want to look at stuff online. So when you click on the relevant link on the list of social statements, this is what you'll find, all of these different resources about each thing. So looking at the social statement on abortion, the body together started by talking about the basis of our unity, because this is something about which we don't agree. And before we look at the specifics of what it says, let me editorialize a little bit. The ELCA is intentionally a broad, inclusive, big tent denomination. There are wide varieties of opinions about this and every other issue that you care to name within our ranks. That is very much on purpose. I have grown increasingly despairing of the possibility of doing that for any organization or any church, to try to hold the center. Because that's not the direction that it seems like society and culture are moving. We are sorting ourselves out with all kinds of purity tests. And one of the things that led me back to the ELCA and led me to become a pastor is that on any issue you want to name, when it comes down to it, what does the ELCA think about this, that, or the other thing? The answer is always going to be the same. Well, in the ELCA, there's some people that think this, and there's some people that think that, and there's some people that haven't made their minds up yet. We've got a lot of diversity of opinion. That is on purpose. If we agree on the big thing, Jesus, and bigger things like Scripture and the confessions and the Constitution, then we don't have to agree about everything. Diversity of opinion is secondary to the unity that we have in our shared ministry of the gospel. So that's where this social statement starts, is talking about the basis of our unity. And if you read through those bullet points, it is very explicit, as well as when it gets to the second thing there, the gift of our diversity. And I am going to read that one just in case you can't read it in the back. Because we are united in Christ through faith, we have both the freedom and the obligation to engage in serious deliberation on moral matters. Induced abortions is one of the issues about which members of the ELCA have serious differences. Those differences are also found within society. Does that sound about right? Yes, it does. So then they go on pages 2 and 3 to explain some of the convictions from which we work. And the second of those bullet points, I think, is, just to pick one of them at random. The gift of human life comes from God, has intrinsic value, worth, and dignity in all phases of development, and is guided by God's law. That seems about right to me. Opinions about that might vary, but I think that's a faithful and healthy statement. So each of these bullets is just places where the social statement on abortion unpacks kind of some big convictions that we have. I'm going to read the last one too, again, just for the sake of folks in the back. As a community of forgiven sinners, our love for a neighbor embraces especially those who are most vulnerable, including both the pregnant woman and the life in her womb. One of the things that you'll notice all through this statement, every quote that we get to, every section and subsection, because we are Christians of the Lutheran persuasion. What does Lutheran mean? One of the things Lutheran means is the soulless. We're saved by grace through faith, through Scripture, not through any works of our own, right? Word alone, grace alone, faith alone. That's us. But another identifying characteristic of Lutherans is that because we are sinners forgiven by God for the sake of Jesus Christ, we are set free to turn ourselves out towards our neighbors. So look for the word neighbor in all the rest of these quotes. Neighbor comes up over and over and over again. So they continue working through some of the things that they're concerned about. One of those things is that there is some real concern about the number of induced abortions. There's too many happening. And then they start making very specific claims, like, and this is a quote from page 4, abortion ought to be an option only of last resort. Therefore, as a church, we seek to reduce the need to turn to abortion as the answer to unintended pregnancies. And then they lay out a whole bunch of stuff about hospitality, which again is neighbor focused. So I'm just going to read through these because I think they're really interesting. Congregations are encouraged to support daycare centers and nurseries in their facilities. Services and shelter should be provided, especially to enable young mothers and fathers to continue their education and care for their children. Members should also be encouraged to become foster and or adoptive parents. So if you're concerned about the number of abortions, here's some things you can do about it. By our policies and practices as a church, we need to indicate that we are truly supportive of children through the long years after and not only before they are born. I'm just going to leave that for a second to sink in. Among the convictions that we work from as we consider these things, the document also has some precautions, some things that we need to be on guard against because we are a church as a community supportive of life. Marriage is the appropriate context for sexual intercourse. This continues to be the position of this church. Does that strike anybody as surprisingly conservative? Probably. But that's what we actually say. That's what we actually believe. And that's what we actually teach about the appropriate boundaries for sexual intercourse. We also affirm that the goodness of sexual intercourse goes beyond its procreative purpose, right? So it's not just for making babies. And then here we come to another thing. I said that the focus on neighbor is one thing that you'll notice over and over again. Another thing that you'll notice over and over again, or at least it struck me, is how often man and woman come up. Whenever sexual intercourse occurs apart from the intent to conceive, the use of contraception is the responsibility of the man and the woman. So there's lots of mutual responsibility language that comes up throughout this document. There's also some commentary about education. And again, I was kind of surprised when I read this myself. This is not the first time I've ever read this, but I was just reminded because how we talk about sex in schools is kind of a hot topic right now. So how about, again, this is a quote from page 4, our congregations and church schools, right? Our congregations and church schools ought to provide sex education in the context of the Christian faith. How many congregations do you know that do that? Not many. Such education, beginning in the elementary years, needs to emphasize values such as responsibility, mutuality, and abstinence from sexual intercourse outside of marriage. Parents should also be prepared to teach sexual responsibility to their children in the home. It is especially important that young men and young women, again, mutuality, be taught to exercise their sexuality responsibly. This is a rhetorical question. Are you surprised at what you've read and or heard so far? So mutuality, again, because this church recognizes parenthood as a vocation that women and men share, we should encourage and educate, and get a load of this, fellas. We should encourage and educate males from an early age to assume more responsibility for raising children. Congregations should provide parenting classes and support groups for fathers and for mothers. You heard some buzz about the lack of men in worship or, I'm sorry, question?
I don't want you to get to what I heard is very binary.
It is. Yep. Thank you for bringing that up. The question was that the language so far has been very binary. There's nothing about LGBTQIA2S+ that's been said so far. That's a fact. Recall that this was adopted in 1991. Yeah. So if it comes to the body that we need to re-examine this, there's a process for that. Yeah, yeah, but I noticed that as well. I noticed that as well. And I don't know if I should have had a disclaimer or a content warning or something back at the beginning, but it's what is 1991, 33 years ago? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
It's the year I graduated from high school. Did you? All right. Class of 91. Here we are. But yeah, boy, a lot of stuff has changed. Yeah, but that's a salient point. It is very binary in its language. So again, working from common convictions, I just love this. As a life-affirming church, we oppose messages in the media and elsewhere that encourage irresponsible sexual activity. Materialism, individualism, and excessive concern for self-interest. The desire for perfect children and treating those who are not as if they are disposable. Attitudes and practices that are inhospitable to children and to the women who bear them. And low regard for human life, especially the lives of African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, or Native Americans, and of many women and children who are poor. Those are things that we stand opposed to. And we as a church seek to reduce the need to turn to abortion as the answer to unintended pregnancies. So that's the convictions from which we work. The next place that the document goes is how we make decisions about that. And one of the first things they identify is moral complexity. And I'm not gonna read through that whole thing, but they do a really great job of highlighting all the ways that this is just a prohibitively complex moral issue. As we wrestle with a complex moral issue, specifically in this case, abortion, there are two courses of action that come out of that. The first of those is to continue the pregnancy. And here's a quote from page 6. Because of the Christian presumption to preserve and protect life, this church in most circumstances, encourages women with unintended pregnancies to continue the pregnancy. Up to this point, there has been loads of language about how the church has a responsibility to support and care for our neighbors, so that this statement, which in isolation can sound like it's putting all the onus on the mothers, that is not the intent. That is not the case. We as a body have a moral obligation to support and uphold and care for them. So that this one line, if you just lift this line out, if you cherry pick this line out, that's deeply unfair. I'm concerned about that. I admit to having some reservations about that myself, but you have to read all the stuff that leads up to this point. No mother should ever be forced to do this in isolation or alone. We have an obligation to our neighbor. If this is what we're going to suggest, then we need to pony up all kinds of support, all kinds of resources, and all kinds of money. So that's where they come down on the first of those two options. The second of those two options is ending pregnancy, which the ELCA in this social statement says is morally responsible in some particular cases. If there's a risk to the health or life of the mother, if the pregnancy results from rape or incest, or if there is extreme fetal abnormality that means it's incompatible with life. In those tragic circumstances, we hold that abortion, induced abortion, is morally responsible. But there's also a very important caveat. The later the term, the more serious issues become. Late-term abortion is not morally responsible when, and this is very specific language that, again, I found kind of surprising. Late-term abortion is not morally responsible when a fetus is developed enough to live outside of the uterus with the aid of reasonable and necessary technology. I baptized twins that were born. At the time, they were the smallest twins that the Mayo Clinic had ever seen. Grace and Trinity were their names, if I recall. The two of them together weighed less than a can of pop. They were little. They were in the NICU for a long time. I mention that because reasonable and necessary technology, again, has come a long ways since 1991. So that's something that we'll need to continue to wrestle with. And it might be that we need to revisit this social statement. So those are the two courses of action. Then we move on to talk about public policy issues related to abortion. There's some really helpful discussion about the law. And when I say the law here, please understand that I mean the law in terms of civil law, not law like the law and gospel divide that preachers tend to, right? This is civil law. We're getting kind of short on time, so I don't want to linger too long here. Prevention is highlighted as something that's important. Education is something that's highlighted as important. Have a look at the last bullet there. We recognize the need for contraceptives to be available. For sterilization, voluntary sterilization to be considered, and for research and development of new forms of contraception. We, as a body, discern the need to advocate towards support for life after birth. And there are some huge ramifications of that. We need to work towards laws that support access to affordable health care, child care, and housing. How about that? We need to work towards laws that guarantee income from employers, whether that's from employers or government assistance. We need to work towards laws that increase support for education, nutrition, and services that protect children from abuse and neglect. And we need to advocate, we are together committed to advocate for laws that uphold both maternity and paternity. The law must hold both parents responsible for the financial support of their children. Again, mutuality. The position of this church is that government has a legitimate role in regulating abortion. From page 10. Laws should be enacted and enforced justly. If we're going to get the government into things, laws should be enacted and enforced justly for the preservation and enhancement of life. It should avoid unduly encumbering or endangering the lives of women. So if we believe that the government does have a role in regulating abortion, then that means some other things as well. Again, there's a list of things that this church opposes, and I want to read through these because I find them kind of surprising. As a body, we discerned that this church opposes the total lack of regulation of abortion. That's not something we support. We also oppose legislation that would outlaw abortion in all circumstances. That is also not okay. So free for all is not okay. Total ban is not okay. We oppose laws that prevent access to information about all options available to women faced with unintended pregnancies. We oppose laws that deny access to safe and affordable services for morally justifiable abortion. We oppose mandatory or coerced abortion or sterilization. We oppose, I didn't hit enter there, that should be another bullet point. We as a church also oppose laws that prevent couples from practicing contraception. And as a body, we discerned that this church opposes laws that are primarily intended to harass those contemplating or deciding for an abortion. There's a lot in that list of things that we as a body discerned we opposed. And then there's kind of some concluding stuff. So I'm just going to read this paragraph. This is sort of the bottom line towards the end of the document. The position of this church is that in cases where the life of the mother is threatened, where pregnancy results from rape or incest, or where the embryo or fetus has lethal abnormalities incompatible with life, abortion prior to viability should not be prohibited by law or by lack of public funding for abortions for low-income women. On the other hand, this church supports legislation that prohibits abortions that are performed after the fetus is determined to be viable, except when the mother's life is threatened or when lethal abnormalities indicate the prospective newborn will die very soon. Beyond these situations, this church neither supports nor opposes laws prohibiting abortion. Again, there's a lot in that paragraph. And then because we're Lutheran, there's some things that we haven't decided about. Public funding of abortion, laws regarding public funding, laws regarding spousal consent, and laws regarding what we do with minors. Almost at the very end, there's this, and man, this is one thing. Like, if there's one statement from this whole thing that I hope you take away, it's the one that I have highlighted. It is through the public processes of our society that the common good is sought for all. We're concerned about our neighbors. This church encourages its members to participate in the public debate on abortion in the spirit of respect for those with whom they differ. This church encourages its members to participate in the public debate on abortion in a spirit of respect for those with whom they differ. If you haven't read the Small Catechism lately, go back and look up the 8th commandment. We are to defend our neighbors, to speak well of our neighbors, and to explain their actions in the kindest possible way. So, did you find some things in there that you agree with? Probably. Did you find some things in there with which you disagree? Almost assuredly. Were you surprised at anything that was or wasn't included? Probably. All of which leads me, and this is just my personal opinion, right? My take on this is that it is a faithful, nuanced, well thought out, middle of the road, mainstream position to take on this issue, which I think you will find if you look at all the other social statements too. Faithful, nuanced, well thought out, middle of the road, and mainstream. We are not extremists. But is that how you think most people regard the ELCA? No. I don't know what to tell you except go back to the social statements. Go read what we actually believe. Go read what we say we're supposed to teach. Which I think is infinitely better than making decisions based on social media posts. But maybe that's just me. All right, where are we at for time? Question, Marlon, yes, ma'am.
This is my question. What kind of responsibility does the church have to live into our social statements?
What kind of responsibility does the church have to live into our social statements? If you go to, I can tell you where that's laid out black and white, is in that policies and procedures and what it means. I would encourage you to go to that document and read it. These social statements are intended to be the norm for what we teach and say at every level of the church. I might just be cynical when I say this, but I don't know how good a job we do of living into these social statements. In fact, I would even go so far as to say, I don't think we do a very good job of living into these social statements. But I think the big reason that we don't do a good job of living into them is because we don't know what they say. We've never looked at it. We've never considered it. We've never wrestled. So it, like a lot of things, you know, they get adopted and then they just kind of disappear. You know, we already talked about that. We decided that. And then what are we left with? Tweets and posts. That's just a really bad way to form opinions about this church or about people in this church or about leaders in this church. So go back and have a look at them. Yes, ma'am.
Questions up at the end, whether things you disagree or just real quick.
Sure. Yes.
This is just a comment as a leader. The short synopsis is a really helpful document. Like when Roe versus Wade was overturned, I printed out the abortion social statement and the short synopsis.
It's a 2-page summary.
Yep, to have available to get people started. So if they looked at the short synopsis, it was like, okay, now I'm curious and interested to look at the whole document. They're really helpful.
Yeah.
To get people started, especially when things come up, like Roe versus Wade, or, you know, as we talk about human sexuality, we have to discuss that one, looking at Vanessa and some of the language.
Yeah.
Changed.
Yeah, so for the benefit of our folks on Zoom, Pastor Danette was saying that the 2-page summary that you saw on when I showed you, go to the social statement on abortion, there's lots of resources available. The 2-page summary is really, really helpful. The document itself is, well, I don't know, the one that I printed. Also funny, if you look at my working copy of this, if you look at stuff that I highlighted, like there's like the whole thing is highlighted. It's all good. The copy that I had is just 11 pages. So you can have the 11-page social statement, and that's what I have printed out. If you want a copy of that to take home, you can have one of those, or you can access it online. But the summary document is really very, very helpful for this or for other issues about which the church has adopted social statements. Is that a fair summation of what you said? All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
So the information process, does that come more mainly through the pastors? Or how is it directed to the congregation?
So communicate, the question is the information access, does that come from pastors or is that communicated directly to the congregation?
Discussion.
Yep, so the material that's intended to be used to produce the draft that eventually gets adopted or amended or whatever. Yep, any communication about that should come to the pastor and to the council president. Because there are situations of which I'm aware, and again, I'm going back to 2009, I had colleagues that very pointedly did not want their congregations to talk about that. So they stymied the conversation. And there was no amount of shin kicking that I or anybody else could do to get them to change their mind. But any communication about that should come not just to the pastor, but also to lay leadership. And if lay leadership wants to talk about something that the pastor doesn't want to talk about, call me. Because they really should. It's irresponsible not to. It does damage to the body not to. Yes, ma'am.
For anyone interested, there's a social statement currently in process.
I have a feeling this is going to be a long comment, so I'm going to hand you the microphone.
I was just gonna say, for anybody interested, there is a social statement that's currently in process. I believe it's called Civic Life and Faith. Yeah. I'm gonna look it up. I haven't yet, but it's like a 6 session that you can do almost as a, not a Bible study, but a statement, and offer your feedback then to the task force working on it. And I think that's until October.
And boy, I tell you what, if you're concerned about polarization in the social sphere or in your congregation, have a look at that thing. It does such a good job of explaining what unites us and what and what's secondary. It's really, really good stuff. Yeah.
So follow up with that question.
Yes, sir.
As a council president, do we get, I mean, I don't ever remember seeing some of this stuff.
Sure.
So do we get highlights from the Senate, or am I just missing the information that has?
Sure. So the question is, as a council president, did you miss something, or are there other places that it's highlighted? I believe that it's highlighted in Senate communications. I will double check on that and make sure that it is, if it's not. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
They sent out check it out for the congregation to look at.
Yeah, so in the discussion phase of things, you should have gotten those materials. And if you missed them, let us know and we'll make sure to get you linked up on them. But after a social statement is passed, every congregation gets a copy. So, yep. All right, we're a few minutes past time and I'm gonna get yelled at if we're late. I'm already getting yelled at, why don't we just stay? No, I've been yelled at before. All right. Yeah, it's already 4 o'clock. How about that? So thank you all for being here. I didn't allow a lot of time for feedback and discussion because I wanted to be focused on what the document actually says. There's a whole lot in there to talk about. I hope you will. If you want a copy of the social statement, I've got, I think 20 or 25 of them up here. Thank you.